Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery, where this week we're going to be tackling one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of all time. One that I weirdly haven't actually seen another true crime YouTuber cover. This one satisfies both my interest in unsolved mysteries and history. Of course, we're talking about Amelia Earhart. But first, I would like to thank the sponsor of this week's video, who I'm happy to work with once again, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community that has over 25,000 classes in pretty much anything you can imagine. I feel like I've learned so much on Skillshare already. One of my favourite hobbies at the moment is just to scroll through the Skillshare website until I find something that takes my fancy. I've taken 3-minute Spanish classes, I've learned loads of cooking tips and tricks, I've learned how to make a podcast, and this month I decided to take the Storytelling 101 Character, Conflict, Context and Craft class because I've decided that I'm writing a book. I've had these characters in my head for a really long time, along with this sort of vague idea for a storyline, but I just haven't known where to start. And then it clicked with me that there's probably a class in it on Skillshare. And I was right, there's actually loads of writing classes on Skillshare. Look out for my book in bookstores in 20 to 30 years time, probably. A premium membership gives you unlimited access. You can start learning whatever it is that you want to learn. As I say, I always love to promote knowledge and learning on my channel as well. I do what I do, I love to impart wisdom, and Skillshare is just the perfect company for me to work with on this. Skillshare is giving away a free 2-month unlimited access trial to whoever clicks the link that'll be in the first line of my description box down below, and then after that it's only $10, around £7 a month. Honestly, I cannot recommend Skillshare enough. And with that, let's jump back into our video, which is all about Amelia Earhart, a name you've probably heard a lot, but do you actually know who she is and what she did? That's what this video is for. So she was born on the 24th of July 1897 in Atchison, Kansas, to Edwin and Amy Earhart. Now, Amelia's childhood was very unconventional for the early 1900s. She actually lived primarily with her maternal grandparents in Atchison during the school year, and then she would spend the summers in Kansas City with her parents. Her grandparents had a lot of money, they were very well off. Her grandfather spent time as a federal judge, so Amelia Earhart had a very privileged upbringing. Amelia attended a private school where she got the best education that money could buy. But she got into trouble a lot because she had this very independent nature. She didn't like following rules. She liked to live her own life and go on adventures from a very, very young age. So Amelia is primarily raised in Atchison with her grandparents until she's 12 years old, when her and her sister go to live with her parents in Des Moines, Iowa. Their father, Edwin, worked as a lawyer for the Rock Island Railroad, and they'd recently transferred him to Iowa. And it's at this point, when they moved to Iowa, that Amelia and Muriel are enrolled in public school for the first time. And this kind of worked out for Amelia because it gave her a little bit more freedom to be who she wanted to be. Her mother, Amy, refused to raise her daughters according to conventional societal standards of the time. These standards meant that a girl must be a lady, gentle and well-behaved and polite. And Amy just didn't want that life for her daughters, and so she raised them to be independent, free thinkers. She didn't believe in raising her daughters to be those nice little girls, and she didn't even dress them according to the standards of the time. She dressed them in bloomers and let them go out and play on the street, and it did cause a bit of scandal in the community because these girls weren't dressed like proper little girls. Amelia realised from a really young age that the boys were given a lot more freedom than the girls were, and she wanted the same. She wanted this same freedom, and her and her sister would literally go off on adventures all day, and they'd come back covered in mud and dirt, and they'd just live a free life. I suppose by today's standards, Amelia would be referred to as somewhat of a tomboy. It's around this time that Amelia first attended the Iowa State Fair with her parents and recalls seeing an airplane for the first time, and she said that she was just thoroughly unimpressed by this hunk of metal. She later said it was a thing of rusty wire and wood and looked to be not at all interesting. So Amelia Earhart and planes weren't exactly love at first sight. As the daughter of a railroad employee, Amelia travelled a lot and she was fascinated by the mechanics of the railroad, and she started to invent her own things, design mechanics from a really early age. She once made a trap to capture stray chickens and it worked. But things weren't always easy for Amelia because her father was an alcoholic. In 1914, he was forced by the railroad to retire and he went and spent a month in rehab, but his job was never reinstated. And around this time as well, Amelia's grandmother, the woman who basically raised her, died. And so the house that she was pretty much raised in had to go for auction, and Amelia said this sort of signified the end of her childhood. Things are really hard at home for the Earhart family, and so Amy, the mother, decides to take her daughters and go and live with a friend in Chicago. Amelia's a teenager at this time, and so she starts canvassing all the local high schools in the area in Chicago. And she decides that she doesn't want to go to the school nearest her home because their science lab, their chemistry lab, was tiny. She described it as just like a kitchen sink. And so she eventually starts attending Hyde Park High School, where she graduates in 1916. By the time at this high school, though I assume that the science program was really good, she just didn't have any friends. She wasn't that popular. She sort of really struggled there, although she seemed to do well academically. Her yearbook says, Amelia Earhart, the girl in brown who walks alone. But one unhappy year at school didn't exactly put a dampener on Amelia's ambitions. Although at this point flying wasn't even an idea in her mind, she was smart, she was bright, and she knew that she just wanted to be a successful woman. Her alcoholic father had installed in her two things: a deep hatred of alcohol, which would continue throughout her entire life, and this need to be financially secure. She needed to be successful. She kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about successful women in predominantly male-oriented fields, and at the time this was few and far between, but she looked up to all of these women who are doing amazing things in their fields, despite men telling them that they probably shouldn't be. Once she graduates, she begins junior college at Algonquin School in Rydell, Pennsylvania, but she never actually completes this program. Algonquin School was an exclusive finishing school just outside of Philadelphia, where Amelia did excel in her studies and she quickly became vice president of her class. She just never finished. During Christmas of her second year there, Amelia goes to Toronto, Canada, where her sister Muriel was attending school. When she's in Toronto, Amelia sees an amputee who's come back from the war, and from that moment on she refuses to return back to school, and she becomes a volunteer nurse at a hospital for veterans, and she continues to work there until the armistice of 1918. She's there throughout the war and the Spanish influenza epidemic, from which she actually got ill herself. And because of this illness, she suffered sinus problems for the rest of her life. Considering she would go on to be famous for flying planes, sinus problems and being up in the air don't exactly mix. And this whole experience as a nurse at this hospital made her a lifelong pacifist. She hated war. From Toronto, Amelia goes back to live with her sister and her mother in Northampton, Massachusetts. In the autumn of 1919, she attends Columbia University in New York City, but she leaves after just 1 year to join her newly reunited parents in Los Angeles, California. When Amelia is 23 years old, she goes with her father to visit an airfield in Long Beach, California, where a man called Frank Hawks, who would later go on to be a famous air racer, gives her an experience that will change her life. Her father pays $10 for her to go up on a 10-minute flight, and she said as soon as she left that ground that she knew she had to fly. The moment she touched back down, she was determined to fly for the rest of her life. She works a variety of different jobs and she manages to save $1,000 for flying lessons, which in those times was a lot of money. She had her first official lesson on January 3rd, 1921 with a woman called Netta Snook. In order to even reach the airfield, you had to take a bus right to the end of the line and then walk for 4 miles. She was really dedicated to learning to fly. She persuaded her mother to help her out with some money when she couldn't quite afford the final part of the $1,000. She had her inheritance from her grandmother, but it was administered by her mother, and this money just slowly disappeared. On December 21st, 1921, almost exactly a year since she first went up in the sky, she receives her license from the National Aeronautics Association. She continues working hard, she continues saving money until she can eventually afford to buy her own plane, a second-hand, bright yellow Kinner Airster biplane that she nicknamed the Canary, just this bright yellow, old plane. On December 22nd, 1922, she flies to a height of 14,000 foot, which broke the record for female aviators. In May 1923, she becomes just the 16th woman in the USA to receive her pilot's license. But in 1924, her parents separate yet again, so Amelia has to sell her plane and buy a car to drive her mother to Boston, where her sister was still in school. Amelia then re-enrolls at Columbia in New York City, but she can't afford to continue once again for more than a year. So she returns to Boston, where she becomes a social worker, and after quite a long time of not flying, she takes up flying once again. And she actually becomes this small local celebrity because she eventually flies the first official flight out of Denison Airport in 1927. And she also writes for a local newspaper where she promotes flying, a really new concept for the time. That same year, Amelia gets a call from someone called Captain Rayleigh, who asks her, "Would you like to fly the Atlantic?" And she accepts. Today, hundreds, maybe even thousands of flights go transatlantic every single day. But in the 1920s, this was such a crazy idea, it was barely done. So this flight was a scheme thought up by somebody called George Palmer Putnam, and he chose Amelia because of her flying experience and, ironically, because of her ladylike appearance, when in reality Amelia did everything to not come across as a lady. She didn't want to be seen as a lady, she wanted to be seen as a successful woman in her own right. So from June 18th to 19th, 1928, she crosses the Atlantic from Newfoundland, Canada to Wales, along with pilot Wilma Stultz and mechanic Louis Gordon. And she said that she never once touched the controls, she just sat there like a sack of potatoes. But she became world renowned as the first woman to fly the Atlantic. From that moment on, George Palmer Putnam becomes her manager, and then in 1931, he becomes her husband. He proposed to her 6 times, she kept turning him down until eventually she agreed to marry him. But the two didn't have a normal marriage by the times. Amelia said that she needed to maintain her independence and that she saw marriage as a partnership, not as an ownership. She had very liberal ideas for the time. She kept her own name, she refused to take his. He arranges all of her flying engagements across the country and all of these lectures. She goes across the country giving lectures to people about aviation, about flying. And George basically wants her to get as much publicity as possible, as per his work as her manager. She was the 1920s version of an influencer. Some people seem to think that the idea of companies paying specific people to promote and wear their products is a new thing. It's really not, and Amelia Earhart proves that. She was a 1920s influencer. She released her own clothing line after years and years of just sewing and designing her own clothes. And these clothes were released in stores right across the country, Macy's, things like that. It was actually an active living line, which was kind of unheard of for females at the time. It was controversial, but it was really popular. These clothes sold out. She also had her own luggage line, obviously she's a pilot, luggage. And she did all of these endorsements for one reason, to help her afford to fly. And of course flying was not a cheap hobby. She even accepted a position as associate editor at Cosmopolitan magazine, where she wrote a column focusing on the role of women entering the aviation field and just asking people for acceptance. But not all publicity is good publicity. People started to write that she wasn't even a good pilot, she was just this puppet figure created by her husband. And so Amelia, being this strong independent thinker that she was, decides to prove these people wrong. And so on the morning of the 20th of May 1932, 34-year-old Amelia Earhart sets off from Newfoundland, Canada for a solo flight across the Atlantic. She intended intended for her flight to land in Paris, as Charles Lindbergh had done years earlier. But this flight wasn't an easy one for Amelia, who was all on her own up there. She contended with really strong northerly winds, there were icy conditions, there were mechanical problems. So she actually ends up landing in a field just north of Derry in Northern Ireland. And she lands after 14 hours and 56 minutes in the air. She was the first woman to fly solo, non-stop across the Atlantic. She would go on to receive a number of different accolades for her achievements, including a gold medal presented to her by President Herbert Hoover. Over the coming years, she would do many more impressive flights. She became the first solo aviator to ever fly from Honolulu, Hawaii to Oakland, California. Many others had tried and failed. She sets altitude records, she becomes the first person to fly an autogyro across the USA, she breaks her own speed records, and she becomes the first person to fly solo from LA to Mexico City to Newark. Between 1930 and 1935, she breaks 7 different women's speed and distance records in a variety of different aircrafts. She was unstoppable. She was one of the best at what she did, and she knew it, and so she decides to start challenging herself even further. In 1936, she starts planning an around-the-world flight. Although others had done an around-the-world flight, hers would be the longest at 29,000 miles because she basically intended to follow the equator. She had recently joined Purdue University as a visiting faculty member to counsel women on careers and as a technical advisor to its Department of Aeronautics. And so with financing from the university, she commissioned a special plane made to her own specifications, including extensive modifications to the fuselage to allow for extra fuel tanks to be on board. She chooses navigators Fred Noonan and Captain Harry Manning to join her on this trip after a lot of careful consideration. Manning was a very skilled radio operator and he knew Morse code. Noonan had vast experience in navigation in both marine and flight navigation. Their first attempt at this around-the-world trip came on March 17th, 1937. She intended to fly east to west around the world, and so the flight takes off from Oakland, California, intending to land in Honolulu, Hawaii as the first leg. And they do land in Honolulu, but there's some small issues that are picked up during that first flight. And so the plane required servicing once it reached Hawaii, and the flight was to resume just 3 days later. But there was an issue on takeoff and the plane ends up crash landing, maybe because of a blown tyre or maybe because of a landing gear fault, or some people said that it was pilot error. But the aircraft is damaged and so they can't continue with the second leg of their flight. The plane is shipped back to California for repairs and Amelia follows. When back on the mainland, Amelia immediately starts securing funding for a second attempt at this trip, and it eventually takes off on June 1st, 1937. Now by the time this second trip comes around, Harry Manning had decided to leave the crew, leaving just Amelia and Fred. Neither of them were as adept at wireless code, Morse code, as Manning was, and so they decide to drop the telegraph transmitter from the plane, as Amelia just felt it would be a dead weight. They weren't going to need it. Amelia considered herself an old school aviator. She didn't like all this new technology that was coming out. She could do it her own way, the old way. And I find that so funny that she considered Morse code to be this brand new technology, whereas nowadays obviously it's completely outdated. For this second flight, they actually decide to fly west to east instead of the other way round due to changes in the weather patterns, changes in the winds. And so they changed their planned route, taking off from Miami, heading east. This flight begins a lot more smoothly than the first one did. They made it a huge amount around the world with absolutely no problems. They made stops in Brazil, Dakar, Bangkok, Darwin, amongst loads of other locations. On June 29th, the plane lands in Laos, New Guinea. Now, they'd already completed 20,000 miles of their journey, with only 7,000 miles left to go. Amelia was very anxious just to continue the journey. She didn't want to really stop, she just wanted to get on with it, get home. Whilst in New Guinea, she sends her husband a telegram which says radio misunderstanding and personnel unfitness probably will hold one day. She mentioned personnel problems on a phone call to her husband as well, and it was most likely that Fred Noonan had been drinking. He was well known to be an alcoholic, and Amelia very much disagreed with this, and it's likely that He got drunk in New Guinea, and so they had to delay their journey by another day, and Amelia was not happy about this. But she wasn't about to let it derail her plans. Her and Noonan took off from New Guinea on the 2nd of July at 10 AM local time, and this would be her final flight. Their intended location was a place called Howland Island, which was flat land about 2,000 metres long and 500 metres wide in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. After Howland Island, their next stop was to be Honolulu, and then after that, California, making it back to the USA. They were on the final leg of their journey. While the plane was in the air, the Coast Guard boat was in the sea. This boat was called Itasca, and this boat was just in the sea waiting to guide her to Howland Island. But there was inadequate coordination, which meant that the ship's communications were on a bandwidth that Amelia's plane just didn't have the ability to receive. Basically, they couldn't really communicate with each other. 14 hours and 15 minutes into this flight, the Itasca receives its first garbled transmission from Amelia in the air, talking about the cloudy weather. These messages gradually grow clearer as we can assume Amelia got closer to the boat, but the content of the messages was worrying. We are circling, but we cannot see island. We cannot hear you. Amelia herself only receives one message from the ship, although they've been trying to communicate with her for hours. She continues to broadcast over and over again, the radio strength of her transmissions indicating that she was pretty close, but Amelia just couldn't see the boat and she couldn't see Howland Island. The weather itself around Highland was actually very clear, blue skies, no clouds, but there were clouds about 30 miles northeast. If Amelia had flown into these clouds, into the bad weather, Fred Noonan wouldn't have been able to take the sightings he needed to navigate properly. You can't navigate when you can't see a thing. Amelia's last transmission was made 20 hours and 14 minutes into her flight. It indicated that they were going to continue running north and south. The plane never made it to Howland, it just disappeared. Later on, various US citizens would actually document the reception of messages from Amelia on their own radios on land, thousands of miles away. On July 14th, so 2 days after the plane disappeared, a San Francisco resident actually hears a voice on the radio saying, "Still alive, better hurry, tell husband I'm all right." 3 days later, somebody in Eastern California picks up a message on their radio. "Can you read me? Can you read me? This is Amelia Earhart. Please come in." And this is believed to be the last verifiable transmission from Amelia Earhart. Now, the official explanation for the vanishing is that the plane simply ran out of fuel. One of the messages said that she was running low. The plane would have dropped into the sea, never to be seen again. The Itasca unsuccessfully searched the area northwest of Howland Island, but the waves were so large that the plane would have easily broken up as soon as it hit the water. And there would have been a lot of predators in this area as well. Sharks. However, as they were unable to determine the exact location that the plane went down, they have no idea where they were at the time. It's impossible to really search. President Roosevelt authorized a $4 million search effort with 66 aircrafts and 9 ships. And the search officially ends on the 18th of July 1937, so they searched for a good few weeks. George Putnam refuses to give up though. He actually finances his own search for his wife, but all efforts are unsuccessful. On January 5th, 1939, Amelia Earhart is declared legally dead in a court in LA. Since the disappearance, there have been several different theories formed as to what exactly happened that day. The idea that the plane simply ran out of fuel and dove into the ocean is probably the simplest explanation here, but there is evidence to suggest that something more happened. Several aviation and navigation experts support the theory that the plane simply ran out of fuel, concluding the outcome of this flight simply came down to poor planning and worse execution. They decided that the plane was not fully fueled when it left New Guinea, and it would never have made it to Howland Island even if the conditions were perfect. They said that the plane ran out of fuel 35 to 100 miles off the coast of Howland. But some experts would say that it's highly unusual that in all the searches of the water, they discovered no parts of the aircraft. The waves likely would have caused the plane to crumple into pieces on contact, meaning there would have been little bits of metal just floating around in the water, and they never found anything. But there is another theory called the Gardiner Island theory that basically suggests that Amelia and Fred knew they weren't going to make it to Howland Island. They were in the air, they could see they were running out of fuel, they couldn't tell where they were going, and so they make a decision. Knowing they were going to run out of fuel, they decide to turn south and look for other islands. Although we'll never know for sure, the radio transmissions suggest they actually ran a course which would take them past an island called Baker Island. If they missed Baker Island, they would then hit a series of islands called the Phoenix Islands, which are about 250 miles south-southeast of Howland Island. The theory suggests that they did make it to the Phoenix Islands, to a specific island called Gardiner Island. Gardiner Island is actually now called Nikamaroro. At a low tide, there's a rugged but relatively flat piece of reef that would be exposed, which would offer something to Amelia that would be similar to an emergency landing strip. A week after the disappearance, Navy planes did actually search Gardiner Island. They did see signs of recent habitation, but they saw no signs of a plane or of any people. George Putnam's search also took him to around the Phoenix Islands, but again, they never found anything. And then in October 1937, a group visited Gardiner with some potential settlers. They walked around the entire island, but again, they found no sign of a plane or anything else strange. But then, in April 1940, a skull was discovered on this island, and it was actually quickly buried by the people who discovered it. But the main officer on the island, British colonial officer Gerald Gallagher, didn't learn about this skull being found and buried until the September of the same year, so many, many months later. And when Gallagher finds out, he decides that he needs to do a more thorough search of the island. In doing so, he found bones, a bottle, a female shoe, and a sextant box, which is basically a navigational instrument. When they first found the bones, they judged them to be pretty old, but they thought they'd send them to Fiji to be tested anyway. The examiner tests the bones and decides that they belong to a person who is about 5'5", between 45 and 55 years of age. They noted down all the measurements, they took some photos, but these bones would actually subsequently be lost and never rediscovered. We have no idea where these bones are today. In 1998, there was an analysis of all of this measurement data, and this new analysis concluded that these bones belong to a tall white female of Northern European ancestry, which could be Amelia Earhart. But it was also analysed in 2015, and it was decided they belonged to a robust middle-aged man. And then in 2018, a study decided that Amelia's bone measurements may have matched these bones. All in all, they're going off very old data, they're going off very old photos. They actually have no idea, they don't have the bones to look at themselves. Later expeditions did find potential signs of a female castaway on Gardiner Island, including campfire remains and a woman's compact. In October 2014, it was reported that researchers had analysed a 19 by 23 inch piece of scrap metal that was found on Gardiner Island. This piece of scrap metal was found in 1991, and they identified it as a fragment of the plane. In July 2017, a team of 4 forensic bone-sniffing dogs were taken to the island, and they sniffed out the spot where they think Amelia Earhart may have died. The team says that all 4 of the dogs alerted to this same place, and it was actually a place below a tree very, very near to where the bones were found. So I think we already knew that somebody had died in this area, but the question is, was it Amelia Earhart or not? In 2012, a photograph that was taken in October 1937 on the reef at Gardiner Island was enhanced. This would have been about 3 months after Amelia and Fred disappeared. According to this analysis of this enhanced photo, there was a blurry object sticking out of the water in the lower left corner of the photo, and they said that this was consistent with what would have been a part of the plane. So it is a definite possibility that the two either crash landed near this island and ended up washing up on the shore, or they managed to land the plane maybe on the reef and then it was then washed away when the tide came in. There is another final theory I want to talk about, which is the theory that Amelia and Fred were captured by the Japanese. Perhaps they were in the air, they didn't know where they were going, so they ended up navigating themselves to within the Japanese South Pacific Mandate. The theory first came about in 1966 when a man called Fred Gardiner published a book making these claims that the aircraft crash-landed on the island of Saipan and that they were captured and executed shortly after. In 1990, Unsolved Mysteries actually did an episode on this case, and they did an interview with a Japanese, I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry, woman who claimed to have witnessed the execution. But of course these claims were never really backed up. It was just one person saying that she apparently saw this happen. There are plenty of reported photos of Amelia's time in captivity with the Japanese, but all of them pretty much have been proven to be hoaxes. Since the end of World War II, there have been a whole load of rumours that Amelia and Fred are actually buried about 5 miles south of Saipan. But in 2004 they actually go to dig up this area and they never found any bones. In 2017, a photograph was found in the National Archives of Jaluit Atoll in the Marshall Islands, and people claimed that this photo showed Amelia and Fred. This picture showed a white male on a dock who very much looked like Fred and had the same kind of hairline, and a woman sitting on the same dock with her back to the camera, but the woman had a very similar hairstyle and physique to Amelia. For a while this was big news that they'd found a picture of Fred and Amelia proving that they were alive after the plane went down. But it was really quick to be discredited because the original source of the photograph was found, and it was actually a photograph that was published in a Japanese travel guide in 1935, 2 years before the disappearance. This couldn't have been a photo of them after capture. All in all, I really couldn't find much to the theory to support that they were captured by the Japanese. It probably just stems from racism and fear surrounding World War II. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart is probably the most famous disappearance of all time. But honestly, I don't think there's too much of a mystery there. The plane ran out of fuel. They either had to land on a tiny island somewhere and eventually died just from exposure, or the plane went into the sea. I don't think there's any conspiracies here. Something went wrong in the air and they ended up dying. I actually really enjoyed learning more about this disappearance. It's one that you hear about a lot but you don't actually know the details, so I'm really glad I dove into this one, and I hope that you guys are too. Of course, don't forget to check out Skillshare in the first line of the description box down below. I highly recommend. I cannot rave about this company enough. If you like what I'm doing here on my channel, then make sure you click that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, and of course leave your comments, requests down below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye guys.